Andrew's talk will have a few questions, okay? Question and discussion, and then a small reception. I hope you'll buy a book, but also feel free to look around the exhibition. So, if you don't know, I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder and director of the Skyscraper Museum, and a colleague of Andrew's, who is not an old friend, but as they say, a friend of long standing for many years, as we have taught together at Columbia, and where he is now the distinguished professor of the James Marston Fitch Chair of Historic Preservation, and heads the Department of Historic Preservation at Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. But anyway, he and I go way back, and have enjoyed going around the city on many a walking tour and Society of Architectural Historians junket, and all around the city and the country. And anybody who's ever walked around the city with Andrew knows that he is the expert on the architecture of the city of New York, and an incredibly sensitive and enlightened urban historian who can integrate all of the fields of architecture, which is his principal area of study, but of social history and urban history and American history, and all of the different aspects that are drawn together in this book and other books that this book are subject tonight, which is Biography of the Tenement House Museum here in New York. Andrew's been the historian there, so a consulting historian for a number of years, helped write the Historic Districts Report, the Landmarks, and the National Register, I guess, report. So he really traced sort of on the ground the evolution of that project. And have you been to the Tenement House Museum or not? Some of you ever? If you haven't, you definitely have to go to 90 Orchard Street. You have to read the book first, and then go on a guided tour with an interpreter, because that's the way that you visit this house museum. And so he's really shepherded the project through, along with the former director now, Ruth Abrams, in a long-standing effort, which is really one of the great glories of New York, because along with the skyscraper, the tenement house really describe the two building types which are most characteristic of New York City. So in that way, we've been colleagues for a very long time, and we love cities in the same way, and we love New York in the same way. So I strongly recommend the book to you as a read, and I'm glad you're here tonight to get a sampling of a take on architecture which is quite different than sort of old-fashioned traditional architecture historians have had. One that really looks at the embedded urban history and all of the social strata and the connections that exist in this important social aspect of New York. And I'll mention another area which she's been working on that is equally integrated with the social history, as in the Garment District, and we are hoping that he will be able to do an exhibition on the Garment District and that sort of high-rise development, architectural development, and social development in a future museum here, in a future exhibit here at the museum. So is that enough to say? Right, so here's oh, and this is our next, starting this month, as you can see, May 19th, with a nod to Chicago 1890, with Joanne Merwood Salisbury's new book on sort of focuses on the Masonic Temple, but in the context of Chicago in the late 19th century.
Thank you, Carol. So I'm thrilled to be here because I love this space, but it does seem initially odd to be talking about tenements at the Skyscraper Museum. But it's not such a stretch because of this exhibit, because what this exhibit has in common, why don't we go to the first image? What this has in common with No, back. Back.
It's loading.
That's not the tenement. Okay. What this exhibit has in common with this is that they're both about density. And this is something that Carol is really, really interested in, are issues of density. The difference is that in Hong Kong, the high-rises are modern structures with all the modern amenities. it's high-rise with good plumbing, which was not the case with these buildings, which were extraordinarily dense in their population at the time, but which housed mostly the immigrant poor in them, and with almost no amenities in them. Things that we today, and even the middle class at the time that these were built in the second half of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, the middle class took for granted things that the people who lived in these buildings didn't have. Just to give you a sort of background statistic, the Lower East Side, where this tenement building is located, in the heart of the Lower East Side, was said beginning in the 1860s and continuing on into the early 20th century, commentators said that this area was the most densely populated place in the world. And they compared the population density of the Lower East Side with London and with Prague, which was the most densely populated city in Europe. I don't know whether these statistics are really true. It's never clear to me whether they're comparing the Lower East Side to all of London and all of Prague, or to the most densely crowded areas in those cities. So I don't know if it was really the most densely populated spot in the world, but it was pretty densely crowded. There were, in the 19th century, the city was divided into wards, similar to now we're divided into community boards. But the 97 Orchard Street is in what was known as the 10th Ward, and the 10th Ward was bounded by the Bowery on the west, by Norfolk Street on the east, by Rivington Street on the north, and Division Street on the south. Not a very large area geographically. It had a population in 1903 of 69,944 people, which was about 665 people per acre. The most densely populated block in that ward was block 414, which is the block on which this building sits. And that block, which is 2.04 acres, had a population of 2,223 people, or 1,089 people per acre. So even if it wasn't the most densely populated place in the world, it was still a pretty dense place when you think about people moving out to suburbs on houses that are on an acre or several acres, and it's a household of 4. We're talking a pretty dense area. So, how did I come to write a book on this building, Biography of a Tenement House? Sometime in the 1980s, about 1986, I got a phone call from a woman named Ruth Abram, and she had a vision that she wanted to create a museum that reflected the history of most Americans. She said she was tired of going to house museums that reflected the lifestyles of the very wealthy, or were the homes of famous people, and that this really was not how most people trace their ancestry in America. And she wanted to create a museum that was an urban museum that said something about the urban history of a huge number of Americans. So she was looking for a tenement to acquire, and her assistant, Anita Jacobson, had seen a tenement at 97 Orchard Street with a for rent sign on it. And they talked to the owner, and they agreed that they would rent some space in this building. And eventually, of course, they bought the building. And this telephone call was, somebody had recommended me. I wasn't teaching full-time at that time. I was doing consulting work, and they called me and said, would you like to write a history of this tenement? Well, I couldn't have been less interested at the time, but when you're a consultant, you don't say no. So I said, okay, I'd come down and talk to them. Well, the day I went down really changed my life. I went into this building. It had been abandoned in 1935. The lower floors, there are 4 stores. They were occupied, and everything above was empty. It had been used for storage, but basically nothing had happened since 1935. And you stood in one of these apartments, and it was so redolent of a past history, and it was such an extraordinarily moving experience to be in one of these apartments, because of course you bring your own history with you here, that I immediately changed my whole idea of what these buildings were about. And this led me to actually look at the city in a very different way, to start looking not at the great monuments of New York, but at at the vernacular architecture of New York, about the everyday building types of New York that are generally overlooked and neglected by historians. And in this way, actually, my work has paralleled a lot what Carol has done, who's really looked at the speculative skyscrapers, office buildings of the city, not necessarily the great monuments of skyscraper construction, but the kind of everyday buildings that were put up by speculators out to make money, just like these were built by speculators out to make money. And a lot of the same forces that created skyscrapers also created tenements like this. Tenements are not great works of architecture. They're not monuments of sophisticated design. They were not designed by prominent architects. Their facades do not exhibit exquisite craftsmanship, and they're not ornamented with fine buildings. They're with fine materials. They're just basic buildings. And so to find what's interesting about them, you have to look beyond what one's preconceptions of, oh, well, the only architecture worth looking at was designed by Stanford White or a famous architect. These are buildings that were cheaply built. They used common materials. And they were designed, and I'm going to use that term designed very, very loosely, and we'll get back to why later on. They were mostly designed by immigrant architects. It's not clear whether they were architects in the way we would think of architects today. We don't know how they were trained, whether they were trained at all. You didn't have to be registered to be an architect. They arrived in America and suddenly they were architects. They probably had little training. They probably weren't fluent in English. They started at the absolute lowest rung of the architecture world, and very few of them rose anywhere above that lowest rung. Yet, these people erected hundreds of buildings that housed tens of thousands of people and helped to create the streetscapes that are uniquely New York. So we can't overlook them. If you want to understand the city, if you love the city as you walk through it, the fabric of the city was created by these virtually anonymous architects and who created a lot more buildings, a lot more important streetscapes than Stanford White ever created. And they're a way of understanding the city beyond just the buildings, because these tenements and other vernacular building types, apartment buildings, garment lofts, speculative skyscrapers, all of these tell us not only about architecture, but about rich social and cultural histories and economic histories as well, about how New York came to be and why it is what it is today. In addition, it turned out there was a more personal story here, which I didn't recognize at first. So if we go to the next one, the little blurb announcing this talk notes that I'm descended from the Mayflower, which is something that I discovered. But I'm not descended from this Mayflower. This is not from the famous Mayflower. Can I have the next, please? I'm descended from... Next. This Mayflower. I was walking down East Broadway with my father one day, and my father pointed to this building and said, "That's where I was born." So I like to be able to say, I'm descended from the Mayflower. But this is a really interesting way to put the tenement in perspective. This Mayflower was built in 1907. It was 7 years old when my father was born. It was built by a Jewish speculative developer named Julius Miller. It was designed by Jewish architects. Bernstein and Bernstein were hugely prolific architecture firm designing tenements. They were immigrants. And it was designed to house primarily Eastern European Jewish immigrants in it. Yet it's called the Mayflower. And I think that it's a metaphor for a larger experience of the vast majority of immigrants and the children of immigrants who came from many backgrounds and moved here and became Americans. And what I find really interesting is that in 1907, that they chose to call it this, that the owner of this building had this vision of America, he as an immigrant and the immigrants who were going to be living here were taking their first step to being Americans. And it's easy to look in hindsight at how the immigrants were Americanized, and I'm sure many of you are the children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren of immigrants who went through this Americanization process. But that in 1907, the developers saw this idea, I think is a really interesting way to look at this. Can I have the next, please? We all know about immigration in general, that New York was the great gateway, the golden door, that many immigrants stayed in New York, that New York went through waves of immigrants, beginning especially in the mid-1840s when immigrants from the German-speaking states and from Ireland arrived, then later in the 19th century when New York became a center for Italians and Eastern European Jews, and smaller numbers of Russians and Slavic immigrants, and later Greeks and others arrived here. So everyone's familiar with the kind of general outline of that. Lots of people left as soon as they arrived, but many, many stayed. And hundreds of thousands of poor immigrants moved into tenements, not only on the Lower East Side, the most famous tenement neighborhood, but in Yorkville, in the East 60s, 70s, and 80s, in East Harlem, on the Lower West Side, almost entirely gone now. We forget that Greenwich Village was almost entirely an Italian immigrant neighborhood, including the West Village. So there were many neighborhoods filled with tenements. Conditions were poor, people often struggled, they worked hard, they fought for justice, they raised their families, and they became part of America, and they changed America at the same time. And this is one of the great themes in America. And one of the interesting things is that this theme is written about extensively. There's enormous literature about immigration. There's enormous literature about labor history. But the physical fabric in which this history took place, be it tenements or garment factories, has been pretty much ignored. So the stage on which the immigrant history took place is something that we really don't know much about. Can I have the next? What I set out to do in my book was to examine the story of the physical fabric of one tenement, because it was both unique and universal at the same time. The tenement at 97 Orchard Street also happens to be the home of the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, which gave me the opportunity to look at this one building. The large history, the history of the laws, the tenement house laws, the vast history of change has been investigated. There's a wonderful book called History of Housing in New York by a colleague of Carol's and mine, Richard Plunz, which talks about the reform laws and other developments. But what it doesn't do is look at how these laws impacted on individual buildings and on the people who lived in those buildings and on the people who owned those buildings. So what I set out to do was kind of turn this book inside out and look at one building and see how can we take information about one building, understand that building, and draw lessons from it that tell us about the tenement and the immigrant experience in general. Next. 97 Orchard Street is an extraordinary survivor. The museum discovered this building in 1988, and even at that time, I don't think that Ruth Abram and Anita Jacobson, the curator who saw that for rent sign, had any idea just how rich this history was going to be. What's so brilliant about the Tenement Museum is how it individualizes and personalizes the universal story of immigration. The museum has done this in a way that the stories at 97